And we're back with Quinn Henoch for round two. Quinn, thank you for coming on. This is going to be, I think, a very useful conversation and one that I've been wanting to have with you for a while. I don't know initially what platform I heard you discuss this topic on that we're going to bring up, but I've heard you discuss it multiple times and I wanted to have more of a drawn out conversation on it as a whole. Before we dive in, for people that may have not listened to that initial episode you were on with us about a year ago, can you just give the audience a brief intro on yourself and all what you do?
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me back on. I am a physical therapist or a physiotherapist, depending on where in the world you are. And I am currently in Southern California. And I am co-owner and co-founder of a group called Clinical Athlete, which is just us trying to create a network of healthcare providers who understand the needs of athletes and who walk the walk themselves and can blend good foundational communication skills, seeing the athlete as a human, with the hard skills, we'll say, of exercise prescription and program design and those types of things. So, sometimes exercise prescription is, can you fill in numbers into an Excel spreadsheet? But for us, it's, can we guide a human through this path of rehab and through this journey of rehab and training, and actually defining done is kind of a defining principle within that process itself. So I think it'll be good for us to talk about. But yeah, I work with active people. I would definitely call all of them athletes, although their level of skill and athletic prowess may vary from top to bottom. I enjoy working with people who have something that they want to get back to, who are unable to do it the way that they want to do it now, and creating a plan for them, and kind of maybe a lot of times shifting expectations of what their view of rehab and training is, both in the short term to kind of get us over this hump, but also just in the long term after they leave me, quote unquote. What are they? Hopefully they've left with something more that they can actually take into their own training and use that, to sustain things for the long term.
Yeah, so you briefly mentioned it, but the conversation today will be around this idea or this conversation with athletes and patients on, quote unquote, defining done, defining the end goal. Quinn, can you provide just a baseline on what that even means and what that may look like? And then we can actually elaborate on how do we go about this process as clinicians?
Yeah. On the surface, me saying, okay, we have to define done, me to a client, define what success is, can certainly be synonymous with just establishing discharge criteria, that we kind of learn in school. My language around the area has evolved a little bit because I don't know, discharge criteria just sounds very white room, hard floor, steel metal bed, it sounds very cold, and it sounds very like, oh, this is just, we fix you, and this is the criteria that you need to meet to be fixed. And then once you meet this criteria, you're off, and I don't need, you don't have to worry about me anymore. I don't have to worry about you, kind of thing. So my language around it has evolved. Let's work on defining success. What does done mean for you? This is me talking to the client. So that's kind of one piece. It's underneath the hood. There's similarities between just the terminology and the vernacular that we use. But I would say that also the difference between saying, okay, let's define what done is for you, let's define what success is going to mean for you, and discharge criteria is that I kind of view like discharge criteria as the objective measures of, whatever it is you're tracking. And I think, ACL rehab is kind of the poster child for everything that we talk about, which is kind of interesting, probably another conversation, but we have all these goals and objective measures that we want to hit for somebody rehabbing ACL, like separated from the person. Do you have 90% symmetry in your, knee extension tour? Whatever hop testing or whatever else you want to do, the agility tests, all these things. Boom, 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 boom. Okay, you've met some arbitrary threshold on these objective measures. You are now discharged from physical therapy. But that's one element. Is that success for them, though? Have they reintegrated into their activity yet in some way? Do they feel, and have they done that to an extent that they feel confident taking what they have done with you over the past however many weeks or months and maintaining that independently? And so to bring that back from something like ACL rehab, most of my clients are not post-op. Most of my clients are dealing with off and on issues that they've been managing over time. And the reason that this is important is because let's say somebody's dealing with some type of ailment. I don't know if it's tendinopathy or low back pain, but it's been kind of a thing that they've been experiencing for 3 years. What are the chances that the very last time they ever experience that thing is with me? I mean, that's great. That would be awesome. I want that for them too, and it is possible. But the probability and the likelihood is that they're going to experience their thing again after we're discharged, or after they're done with me. So what does success mean? Does that mean that that we failed if they ever have another flare up again in the future? That would be, we can't define success like that, because then nobody would be successful, and that would be a very poor way to set somebody up in terms of expectations. Well, actually maybe a good way, because I would always be in business because they'd always come back to me. But my goal is, when it's not a measure, it's not probably not a question of if, when you experience this thing again, you will have learned from us working together and managing this through the process. You will have learned how to manage this independently on your own. Hopefully there's actual changes in it as well. It doesn't happen as frequently. It's not as severe. You're able to bounce back. It doesn't take you off track so much. We will have hopefully gotten to that point as well. But so in those cases, success doesn't mean, hey, this thing never happens again, I never have to deal with it. Success is, I am now much more confident in managing it. And so that's what kind of how I delineate when I'm having these dialogues. So what I would say is defining success with the person is different, because it includes the dialogue, and it includes things that are harder to measure. Like, we can get you more symmetrical in your whatever arbitrary strength measure we have, but is that meaningful for you? Let's imagine you going back to the thing that you want to do. Can you offset any speed bump along the way? Or do you still feel kind of blind and lost and like things are unmanageable? So I know there's a lot there. There's a lot more to be said. I'll stop there. And if you have a follow-up, we'll go from there.
Well, to your initial point, this is different than the more sterile discharge criteria, which is still very important. And like you said, a little bit potentially more objective. And that is very valuable and still needs to occur. Mm-hmm. But to this conversation, it's going to be a little bit different than maybe the like a little bit more maybe black and white, but still messy and gray discharge criteria. The conversation of defining done and your idea of like, these conversations are really important and I need to start having these. Did you already know that as a younger clinician, or when did this start happening for you with your athletes more frequently?
No, I didn't know anything as a younger clinician, and I don't really know anything now. I think I'm just better at not knowing that I don't know. I started having issues with people seemingly not, there was several things. I would discharge someone, we'd get to a certain point, and then they would email me 6 months later and say, hey, had another setback, can we set something up? And I'm like thinking, well, yeah, sure, I'll take your money. But also, This is the exact same, in my mind, I'm thinking this is the exact same scenario that we dealt with. You could just do the same thing and like probably be okay. And it sounds like actually it's not as bad this time around. So I would see those situations and kind of think to myself, wow, so what did I do? What did I actually do for this person? Did I, because when we were working together, did I just distract them while they were going to get better on their own? You know, I was just somebody in their corner, which is good. It gives people reassurance, but like obviously I didn't provide them with anything more than that because they're not, you know, they're not kind of thinking through what we did and trying to apply it. So that was one thing that would happen a lot. Another thing that would happen a lot is in the midst of the plan, being a little bit lost in terms of where to go with the person and trying to figure out literally when we're going to stop being, you know, when that person's going to stop being under my care. Like when you make progress, I'll use the more chronic stuff again. We make progress where the person is more integrated into their activities. They're doing more. They are adding things that they weren't able to do before. They're doing more of it. So not only are they able to integrate some of their desired activities, but they're able to do it more frequently with more volume, but they're still having setbacks. And so in my mind, as a clinician, I'm thinking, well, I mean, look at where we've come from. You know, this is what I'm thinking. Well, obviously, you know, things have gone really well, but from the client's perspective, often that wasn't the lens that they were looking at. The lens that they were looking at it through was, well, I'm still experiencing this. And so there would be rifts in expectations. And then I would think, what I would realize is, oh, well, we never really had a conversation about that. You know, I'm seeing things through my lens, but why would I assume that they're going to see it that way? And that would lead to a useful conversation. However, it's weeks and weeks down the line where it's much more difficult now to have that conversation because it seems like we're backtracking. It seems like the person has had this expectation that they're going to be quote unquote fixed and pain free completely, and this thing will never occur again. And here I am weeks later saying, oh, well, no, you know, success can mean that it's just less. Look, you're doing more. Look at all the stuff you're doing. And it's harder. It's a lot harder than for them to be like, oh, yeah, you're right, when they've had the expectation has been a different thing. So I was running into those situations over and over. And so it just kind of was starting to be a natural evolution for me to address expectations, address even just broaching the conversation of what success is going to mean, because it's, you know, maybe getting ahead of myself a little bit, but it's not something that just gets established on day one and it doesn't evolve. But even just broaching the conversation right from as soon as possible plants the seed to come back to it. And then it's much easier to have that conversation later on when you've already kind of opened the door to it, than to try to open the door weeks in and that, you know, that door has seemingly been sealed shut.
Yeah. So how do you determine when to broach that conversation? Sooner rather than later sounds like that's the preference, but how do you go about that initial broaching the topic? Is it typically with people, the first few interactions, and how does that evolve over the course of care?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's the first few interactions of somewhere in there. I mean, I think the idea is not rocket science. It's talking about what is going to be success. Like what is success going to mean with us working together? I think seems very reasonable, a very reasonable thing to talk about. It's just that we don't typically do it in a way that's meaningful for the person. And we have what we almost like, well, we'll just see what happens kind of thing. And we do that for a while. And then we start to think, okay, well, what tests and measures does this person need? And it's kind of becomes convoluted and it's fly by the seat of our pants. And often the client's not included in the decision making and the dialogue. So the decision is very easy if you want these conversations to go smoother, is to broach them right off the bat. But I mean, I look at my intake form and I have people state their goals because I want them to say it in their own words. You know, what are your short-term goals? What are your long-term goals? Short-term, I define as like 12 weeks are in. Medium term, I'll have them put down as like 3 to 6 months. And then long-term is like 6 months or longer. And this is not with the expectation that they're going to be working with me that long. I just want to know what their expectations of all of it is. Like, what do you actually think you can get to in 3 months, 6 months, a year? And sometimes what I'll see is somebody who has been dealing with something for a long time say, hey, in 12 weeks, be pain-free. And so I know right off the bat, before you start working with me, before you start giving me your money, I want to have a realistic conversation about, based on what I'm seeing and based on the timeline of how things are going on, I want to talk about expectations of how this thing may go and the probability of it going to a certain extent and the probability of it going in this direction. And I will ask them if there are other ways to define success other than being pain-free, because that is something that we will manage. Like, I want that for them too. And it's possible, again, depending on the ailment. But I'll ask, would you also view this as successful if your thing kind of hangs around a little bit every now and then, it comes and goes, you still kind of say hi to it, but when it does occur, it's not nearly as bad. When it does occur, it doesn't last as long. When it does occur, it doesn't derail you nearly as much as it used to. And when it occurs, you feel more confident in managing it in the moment on, independently. And I say, if that was the scenario, would that be success to you? And obviously I'm biased and I'm saying this, so, I'm going to have to dress it up and make it sound good. I can't remember a time in my going on 11 years as a clinician that somebody said, no, I don't like the sound of that. That doesn't sound good. Be pain-free or bust. Because they probably didn't even show up if that's the mentality, if that's how my intake form probably scares them away. But just redefining, even broaching the conversation of another possible way to define success for them right off the bat, not defining it for them and not asking them to sign off on that right away, but just throwing it out there as an alternative is something that's really useful, because now we can come back to that. And that's always kind of the anchor to our conversation. Hey, remember what we talked about? Success can also mean this, because every time there's a setback, people forget. They forget that they had that conversation. You can talk about, hey, there's going to be ups and downs. It's not going to be linear, and their common sense, people are smart. They're like, yeah, it makes sense. But then that first setback happens and they completely forget that conversation and they freak out a little bit. And so if you've had that conversation, you can always come back to it and say, this is exactly what we were talking about on day one, or, on day two, or whenever we talked about, this is the moment that we talked about that. If you didn't have that initial conversation, now you have to have it when the person's all like not in a great spot to hear it. So that's another argument for having it as early as possible, is it's your anchor. Now, the conversation, it can take many forms. I just think even asking them the question, giving them alternatives to what success can mean other than this thing never happens again and you leave my door at 100% stronger, faster, happier than you've ever been. I think success could mean, because a lot of us aren't long-term with people. So for me, it's like you're on the path to that. It's a never-ending journey, but we are gaining momentum towards that. Whether you reach it or not, you came into my door feeling like you're drifting away from that, but you're leaving our partnership feeling like you have gained momentum towards that optimal goal, whether you reach it or not. And so that's kind of how I frame it for people.
That makes sense for these circumstances or individuals where this is a persistent or nagging issue, that there's a high likelihood that this is going to potentially continue and have these ups and downs beyond the relationship that you're with, or the time you're with them. For, let's say, more of there's a success for them looks like, I want to get back to sport next year or by the end of this season or whatever it is, and there's a timeline, and it's let's say we can choose ACL or we can choose any postoperative injury or non-op, but success for them is getting back to the sport. And what if that is their initial answer and description, and early on, based off of that timeline and how they're presenting, it probably is unrealistic? How would you recommend going about those circumstances where it's not where you initially mentioned, reorienting potentially success to, we can have these, how would you feel if it was, we have some fluctuating symptoms, but overall you're able to tolerate and do much more? And generally it sounds like they're okay with that. How do you go about those conversations where it's much more, I want to get back to this thing based off of this timeline because I'm a senior in high school, or this is the only thing I care about? How would you recommend those type of defining success conversations, or defining the end?
I mean, it's the same underlying principles of have the conversations as early as possible. Success, I mean, there are certain cases where if they don't reach that threshold and that deadline and that sport, I'm not going to try to convince them that this has been successful. If that's the objective outcome based goal, then that's what it is. I mean, that's what they want to get back to. It's not my job to necessarily tell them to find a new hobby, but if I feel it's going to be tight, I'll just tell them that. I mean, it goes, there's always things to work on, but we'll talk about the timeline and we'll like reverse engineer. It's like, okay, you want to get back to being able to go full go, like at this date, you want to be full go, no restrictions, done with me, done with healthcare. You are just an athlete again with sport coach like you were before by this date. Well, let's think about what has to happen before that. You have to condition yourself to be able to be in that type of just playing shape for no restrictions. So there has to be a period before that where you are also 100% being able to train as hard as you need to train to be able to participate in the sport the way that you want to. So there's like a period of conditioning that needs to happen in order for you to be able to sustain that type of conditioning to participate in the sport the way that you want to. We need to get you to a certain point. So this is like the phase before you actually return full go into the sport, where we're conditioning, where you need to be able to sustain that. So we have to build you up to that even. And so there's like these blocks of weeks, 4 to 6 weeks, in each one of these phases, where people think like 6 weeks, 6 weeks is enough time. And they're battered and they're not participating in their sport at all. And they're like, yeah, in 6 weeks, I just want to kind of be back and doing what I want to do. And so it's like, okay, so you want like 3 weeks, you've taken 3 months off. And in 3 weeks, we need to be able to condition you enough. You will have built up enough fitness to handle the type of workload to not get hurt again in your sport. And so when we break it down, or we break down the timelines like that, and I'm not an asshole about it, but we're just realistic. It's going to be tough. Here's what we can now, if we work from where we are now, here's where you are, because Now your assessment, this is where all those things become important, because you can define the gap. And this is the idea of a needs analysis. Where do they want to go? Where are they now? What do we need to do to fill that gap? And so I try to kind of reset expectations by reverse engineering in that way. But then I try to ground the situation with them with, here's where we are and here's where we can start. Here are our options for getting you back into these things. I don't know where we'll be at the end of this point, but this is where we can start to just get the ball rolling there. And sometimes they make it, sometimes they don't. You know, I don't have 100% outcome, and I don't have, some people don't get there, but it starts getting their wheels turning too, and it starts getting them to buy in a little bit. And sometimes they, reset their expectations as well. So I wouldn't put somebody at risk, or I would, give my recommendations if I didn't think that they were ready. We would have that conversation too. But I think it's leading them to understand what it actually means that they want to do, like what that actually is going to take. And then a lot of times that helps people like look at it, put it in perspective. I have a client now who's dealing with, he's a weightlifter, trains really, really hard, and is dealing with multiple things: shoulder, knee, acute. They're mostly acute, mostly things that have just kind of popped up in the last 3 months. And he wants to do a meet in a few months. Well, actually, I suggested like not worrying about numbers, because it's constantly chasing numbers, like always pushing thresholds. And I said, okay, what if you took an arbitrary amount of time, 8 to 12 weeks, and we just focused on training to train? We just focused on the process of training. We didn't care about how much we actually lifted. It was get healthy, work on the skill. Your skill won't degrade at all, because we will get lots of practice in, but we'll keep you under a threshold that you can actually maintain, and we'll build up a nice base and a nice stretch of time where you're actually able to create some momentum and feel good, feel like you're ready for the next training session, instead of having to pop, ibuprofen for the next training session, that type of thing. And he was like, yeah, it sounds good. And then the next message was, okay, cool. So I was looking at the meet schedule, and there's a meet, in 12 weeks. So I'm thinking if we can get, like you said, get to the point where I'm feeling good, then I'll be hopefully ready for this meet. And I'm like, okay. So I'm like, then the meet's like 12 weeks away. So I said, okay, that's interesting. So what I had suggested was an 8 to 12 week training block in which you didn't worry about numbers. And again, that's arbitrary. Like it's just an amount of time that I'm throwing out that I would expect things to calm down and for us to accumulate some good, sustainable training. But now you want to do a meet at the end of that. And what does doing a meet mean? Well, it means, because you're fixated on numbers, it means that we would have to start peaking, or you would want to start peaking for that meet, meaning you would want to start going really, really heavy. And you need, a certain number of weeks to be able to build up to that. So not only do we want to get healthy, which is going to take a period of time, an undetermined, unknown period of time for things to calm down, but then we would have to build your fitness back up to the point where you could then start pushing your maximum thresholds to get ready for this meet in 12 weeks. That's what you want to do. And so what I just threw it out there that it's going to be really difficult for you to have both, for you to feel better physically, and for you to be in tip-top condition for this meet in 12 weeks. Like, this is the exact reason that we're kind of having these conversations, is because we're not giving our body enough time to chill, and then we kind of stoke the fire again, that type of thing. So that's an example of reverse engineering from their kind of outcome-based goal and thinking about it more from a process perspective. And again, people are smart. They do have common sense. It's just they need somebody to have a conversation with them sometimes and to put things in perspective. I know I do. I need that stuff too. And I needed to see it from another lens, because it's hard to, when you're feeling it, when you're living it, when you're living the experience and you're thinking about these timelines, but you're also dealing with it. It's hard to have that perspective and that context sometimes. So I think that's one of the big reasons, one of the big things that we can bring to the table as providers, since we can't control biology that much. We can only kind of predict the directional response that our exercise and our training will provide that person. But we do have control over the dialogues and how we communicate and you know, how we address these things for the other person. So I think when there's a deadline, you do the same thing. You provide your professional recommendations and your professional opinion based on timeline and based on what you think you can get done, and you lay out options. And sometimes people are on board with, you know, whatever happens. It would be awesome for me to get back. If not, no big deal. Sometimes it's like a scholarship on the line and doesn't change the reality of the situation. It's the same conversation, but it may or may not turn out the way that you and the client want, and that's unfortunate. And sometimes it does. Yeah, I think us just as clinicians being okay with those situations, but still going through the same process of communication and learning at least what their expectations are going to be. And like, I think it's important to not like come off of that in a way where kind of almost like panicking as a clinician, because we're kind of afraid to say that it's a tight timeline and I'm not sure I can recommend that you are ready to go back to sport, you know, based on the information that we have. Like, those are tough conversations. So I think being consistent is important as well.
Is there, now that you consistently have these conversations, has there been a specific type of archetype or personality that you found has been just the hardest to broach these conversations? And anything since you've kind of, you mentioned early on, you've realized earlier in your career that you were either having these conversations too late, or you weren't having them at all, or they were more of the sterile, this is my discharge criteria. Have you found,
Right.
one, just like what are the more difficult type of interactions here? And then how have you had your own kind of evolution throughout this process on making it maybe more successful of a conversation and just total interaction?
Yeah. I also think part of it in general is accepting that we as clinicians can't necessarily change people and how they view things. We can just be I say it again, we can just be consistent in how we have our dialogue. So one of the big things that's really helped me over the years is not trying to change people's beliefs necessarily and expectations, but it's more of open up the conversation and be consistent with my message and continue to kind of revisit the ideas, show them the progress, which comes back to the importance of having key performance indicators, you know, even if it's just the exercises themselves, like knowing, like being able to look where we've come, where we've been, here's where we are, here's where we were, like being able to have that information for the person in kind of an organized way. But it's the people, you know, that are probably like us, that are hard charging, that it's all or nothing, that want, if they can't do the thing that the way that they want to do it, as much as they want to do it, they don't do it at all, or they do something else just as hard that is different. You know, it's in their mind, it's a solution because it's different, but it's the same overarching issue of just pushing past threshold. So another example is somebody who is I'm working with who does a lot of stuff. He's in the gym 5 days a week. He's outdoors as much as he possibly can. He's doing, very, very active person. And so there's a lot of noise when you're dealing with an ailment like knee pain or something like that pretty much affects everything that he does. It's like, okay, you get them to agree to toning down some element of what we think is kind of a contributing factor so you can try to make sense of things. But it's very hard for somebody who wants to do that for them to chill out long enough for you to actually glean any information. Like a week isn't enough. Just because you tone down whatever it is for a week, that doesn't mean that things are magically going to be back. Like we need time. So that's difficult. And then also they'll try to supplement it with something else. Like, no, we're toning this back. So it, like, for the sake of toning it back, not so you can add something on top of it that we would run into the same problem. So it's those types of people who are awesome. I mean, they're just hard charging people. Like it's not a negative towards them. It's just kind of, that's how they also view fitness is more is more. More is always better. And sometimes more is just more. So I wouldn't say it's easy. Like, honestly, the easy route is not having these conversations. It's just doing what they want and giving them what they think they want, which is do more. Here's a bunch of like mobility exercises that you can do in between the stuff that actually is creating the issue, and not addressing like training load and those types of things, and then just hoping Mother Nature takes care of this at the same time that you gave them 17 mobility exercises so that it seems like it was the mobility exercises and not natural history. That's the easy route. So it doesn't actually get easier. Having these conversations actually makes things harder because these conversations are not easy to deal with. But the key is just be consistent with your message. So you just have a good relationship with the person. First of all, don't be an asshole about it, but just kind of keep reminding them, okay, I always tell people, like, if you do something extra, if you go off program, like it's no big deal. Like, live your life, but just tell me, because I want to be able to have this conversation with you. I want to know from Monday to Sunday, all of the things that you did that are relevant to what we have going on. If you come in and you've had a flare up or things are not heading in the right direction, but you also added 20 miles of road work, of running, or, and I don't know that, how can I possibly make decisions based on where you are right now without that information? So, like, I'm not going to be mad. We're human. So just let me know. And so that's really helped as well, is just kind of humanizing the situation and just being like, like, I get it. And then they're more open with things like that. Like, hey, I didn't do this, but I did this, and I say, okay, cool. And now, but you understand that, I have to make decisions, based on what you've actually done. So when I look back at the plan, you missed these days, but you kind of added this in here. So for me, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to progress anything or to go away from, because we haven't really gotten to this part of things yet. We didn't actually get there. And they're like, yeah, okay. So that, I'm giving you an example of somebody who might expect me to be progressing the program, but yet they haven't actually done the program that we had planned for them to do anyway. So, like, why would we progress something that you haven't done yet? But it's creating an environment in which they feel comfortable enough to be honest and to share, and then to just be consistent with your message in why you're programming the things that you're programming. And, if they continue to go off program or to add things or to kind of push back on us, my recommendation on pulling back on a certain element, you just say, it's just, it's just what we talked about in terms of trying to make sense of things. It's trying to create a little bit more of a pattern, allowing things to calm down. Whatever the message that you have for it, just keep revisiting that and ask, what are your thoughts? Because I don't want to sound like a broken record. So you kind of like acknowledge that you might be annoying as the clinician. You say, I don't want to sound like a broken record. So I know that you understand kind of my idea of acknowledging what might be contributing and us kind of keeping a tighter leash on that aspect. But I want to get your thoughts on that idea. Is that something that you're okay with? Or do you have questions about that in general? And so that is a way to open constructive dialogue that would be the antithesis of what maybe is going through my mind at the moment, which is like, you're not listening. You keep going off program. Why are you doing this to me? But understanding it, that's not going to go anywhere. So it's like understanding it from their perspective. Like, what is your thought process around what I'm telling you and what we've been saying more than once at this point, and what you are doing with it? I'm genuinely curious because I'm missing something on my end. So like, I'm just, as I'm going through, I'm just thinking about all of these dialogues that have happened where we've had something that good came out of it, like a good constructive conversation where I come out having a better understanding of this person. They come out of it having a better understanding of my recommendations, and we move forward, and we have a stronger base of where to come back to. So if the conversation ever happens again, we can come back to it. And it's when I start to know when it's clicked for people is when they start answering their own questions, or almost like kind of finishing the conversations that we've had without having them. Like they'll say, yeah, I couldn't get to this today, but I moved it to this day and I got it done. Or, I added an extra 5-mile run, but, and I know, don't give me, you don't have to progress the next program, until I recover from this. So they start to kind of like get it. And you can tell by the way that they're talking versus before, where it was more of like, okay, well, what do I do now? This has happened. So it's little by little. You're planting the seed. Be patient with your communication. It's like a relationship in anything in your life. You, as the clinician, we feel like maybe we have the answer, or maybe like our perspective is the correct one, which is not untrue or true. It's just, we need to recognize that they have a perspective too, and it's actually their decisions and they're living the experience. So like, we should really take how they're feeling and what they think about the situation into account. And if you're confused, if it seems like somebody is not listening or not understanding, it's probably because you didn't actually dig into how they're perceiving what you guys are talking about. And that's where kind of asking the questions come in, presenting your perspective and asking them their thoughts on that perspective very explicitly, without assuming that they understand it the way that you understand it. And I think that's been really helpful as well. Not easy, but super helpful.
To the end of this interaction with a patient or client, you mentioned this early on in the episode of you'll have these individuals that reach out in 6 months complaining or presenting with a similar concern or issue. And there's maybe some frustration on your end because you had assumed that we had developed this plan for them to manage that if this were to occur. How, towards the end of a plan of care or an interaction with an athlete or a patient, how have you tried to do a better job of reducing the chance of them feeling reliant on you if this were to happen again? Do you have recommendations on how you've done better with that and how other clinicians can do better than maybe we currently are?
Yeah. And to be clear, frustration in, like, for myself, because clearly I didn't give them the tools to help themselves. But also, I have like returning clients. So it happens. what I tell people is, I'm around on standby. I think that you've learned through this process of how to manage things pretty well, and what to do in your exercise program to continue the progress that you've been making. And we talk about that. That's part of defining done, is like them explicitly kind of outlining their plan on how they can keep this going, which is a lot of times just doing the program that they're on. Like, keep doing this. They know how to progress some variable to continue the progress. They know having options to modify if they have a setback. Like, those are all things that we talk about, and I want them to articulate that so that they demonstrate understanding. So that's one thing. And then, but the other thing is, I'll say, like, I'm here on standby. If this happens again and you're a little bit lost, like you have these things, but it's still kind of unmanageable and you're a little bit lost on how to move forward, like, I'm here. If you have a new ailment, I mean, that's the biggest thing. Like, I will say, if something else pops up, because it will, because you train really hard and that's just life, you can implement a lot of these most of these principles apply. It's just that the methods may be different if it's completely different body parts. So they may or may not have just the resources to think about, okay, how can I can apply these principles to my shoulder, even though it was my hip, but I don't know, I'm not privy enough to like shoulder movements and exercises to be able to modify them. They'll reach out. But what's cool is that the next time they reach out, we're just rolling, because we don't have to have as much of these, like, we don't have to set the stage for these conversations. They can still happen again, but it's like a rolling dialogue, and it's I see it as much more of a consultant role. Like, think of any professional consultant role that you've been working with this person for a long time, and you reach out periodically. You just start rolling with the conversation right off the bat. There's not a lot of, like, you understand their philosophy of things, they understand how you tick, and things are a lot smoother in that regard every time that you have a new interaction. So that's kind of how I'll broach it, is like, I'm here on standby, but when they reach back out, I'll also say, a lot of times I will ask, what about this? So if I were to pose this question to you, this is me talking to the client. We did XYZ before in our program. Do you feel like taking the exact same approach this time around would help? And a couple things will happen. They'll say, yeah, I just wasn't sure if this was kind of the same scenario. So sometimes they're just not sure, and they just, maybe they're in the midst of pain, and it's just a little panic, and they reach out to me because they want somebody else in their corner. You know what I mean? Like, that's normal. That's a normal response. And I'll say, okay, no, it's more of reassurance. Like, this really seems like the same kind of idea. And it's just one of those scenarios that we had talked about. Like, you may experience this again. So in my opinion, I would go right back to our plan. I'll outline some points that we talked about, and give them some reassurance that this behaved in this way in the past. We can be pretty sure that it's going to behave that way again, meaning it's going to resolve, or it's going to start going away. And then you can kind of, in the same way that we did together, start working back into things. If you want my guidance, I'm happy to help with that. But I think it'll be very, very similar to what we did in the past. And so they may decide, you know what, yeah, I'm still a little unclear on how to do it myself. So I'll work with them for a little bit. And it's just to get them right back on track. Sometimes it's not. They're just like, okay, that makes sense. I think I can handle it. And then they do. So I'll just pose that initially. Is this something that you think what we did before won't address? And just to kind of see what they say about that. And in their mind, it might be different, and it might be different. Once we actually start working together, then it's a slightly different strategy. Time goes by, not everything is the same. What worked a year ago may not work now. So, like, that's a complex system. Just like in training, like a training block that worked really well to PQ for a meet 2 years ago may or may not be a really useful strategy for you to peak for this meet, that type of thing. So that's how I deal with it. I mean, I just ask them, and we kind of go from there. And when they leave my care, I make sure to leave them with them articulating whatever knowledge that they've taken from it, and letting them know that I am still around. If they need something again in the future. But I view it very much as like I said, that kind of professional consultant role versus like, all right, come on back and let me fix you up.
Yeah, that I agree with all that. And I've in the clinic this week, I discharged a few patients, and it was a very similar conversation of I'm not upset if they come back, but I want to make sure that they feel comfortable moving forward and feel like this interaction has, like you said, been helpful guiding them through the process. And even if they're not fully back to where they want to be, they know what are the next steps. And we've created some contingency plans of if there is a flare up, how do you self manage and how do you adjust? And then it's totally okay if you reach back out with any questions or concerns or thoughts. But I feel comfortable with where you're at, and you are elaborating how you feel. And we've agreed that this is kind of our separation at this point. And generally that goes really well. But sometimes there's the individual that comes back and you feel like nothing of what you said during your first interaction with them has changed. And there was one of my coworkers had that interaction with an individual yesterday in the clinic that came in for evaluation, the exact same thing, hamstring tendinopathy, that they had worked together for like 3 or 6 months. He came back like 3 or 6 months later. It's like they never had these initial interactions, and that can also be tough for you as a clinician, realizing how did this disconnect happen?
Yeah. I was that person. I mean, as like an athlete, I remember because I had dealt with patellar tendinopathy for years, and in college, it's just so funny to think back because in college I was like, I want injections, like cortisone, and my athletic trainers, like, thankfully, were like, no. They were like, that's not going to be good. Here's a bunch of exercises. Like, it sucked though because it's just hard. Sometimes it's hard to get over something until you stop doing it. So I literally had to graduate and stop playing football for my knees to feel better because I just couldn't get away from all of the stuff that we were doing. Like, I couldn't get ahead of it. I didn't want to take enough time off to not play, to like lose my spot that I would have needed, and it was just a vicious cycle. But luckily, like, I was being told all the right things, and I just was not ready to hear it. I was not in the place to listen. And I'm sure that that's happening right now in an area of my life that I not even aware of, So like some people, I feel like I don't want us to sound like we're like on an ivory tower, like we're these emotional, intelligent gods that are omnipotent in communication and understanding people's perspectives, because we're not. And some people just aren't ready to hear the message, and it's not clicking. And I have to remind myself of that too, because I experience the exact same thing sometimes. It's like I'm almost self-conscious to literally repeat the exact same thing that we talked about, because I don't want you to think that I think you're stupid. But there is no other answer unless I were to change my answer simply because I'm self-conscious that you feel that way. And I've probably done that as a clinician, to be honest. And that's part of what I've talked about with you, is just being consistent in this conversation, is just being consistent with your message. Like, it shouldn't change just because the other person is coming back with something, but that thing doesn't actually change my recommendations or kind of how I view it. So say it like it's the first time. I've said that before, but also something else I've learned that I never understood as a young clinician, when clinicians that I respected and that I considered mentors would tell their clients, like, I think that I've helped you as much as I can, even though it seemed to me like there was still progress to be made. Like, either the person wasn't right where they wanted to be, or like, I just felt like, well, you could just keep working with them. Like, why are you discharging them? But now I'm kind of getting it, and it's not a physical, it's not really a physical like training thing. It's more of, for me at least, there are some interactions and patient client relationships in which the message, it can only be, it's gone as far as it can go from a communication and kind of an understanding aspect. And sometimes I feel like people just need a new voice. It happens I'm entrenched in the sport of weightlifting, and people change coaches sometimes. They'll be with the same coach for 10 years and then sometimes they'll change, and it's like, wow. But sometimes people just need a different voice, and sometimes people are just not in the position to hear the message. And I also think it probably works two ways. Like, if this person who came back after 3 months and it's almost like we didn't have those conversations, I think I probably missed something. So I think what you and I talked about in terms of actually understanding, like, this kind of meta thought process of understanding how they're understanding what you're telling them, like explicitly laying out. So here's what we talked about 3 months ago. Like, here's how we managed it. We did this, we did this, we did this. And I want you to tell me what you think about this. My perspective is we could do the exact same thing and manage this in the exact same way. What do you think about that? If I were to tell you this is the same, I could just kind of take out the program. We could talk about the same things, do this, reduce this, and boom, I think it would respond in the same way. But how do you feel about that? And I think you might gain some perspective in that they never really kind of, that never clicked with them. They never actually liked it or agreed with it. And so it didn't quite click. Like, you kind of got to dig under the hood a little bit and not just give your recommendations again, but try to understand what their perspective and understanding of those recommendations are. And I think you'll learn something the second time around, or at least I often do. An example is I had a repeat call with someone. It was a different body part, so it's not the exact same situation, but the nature of it was very similar. Like, foot pain with it was foot pain, but like things have changed in this person, in his life, different scenarios, different jobs, like a lot of different factors and variables, and was having a very acute thing. And those variables were going to go away in his life very soon. Like, the contributing variables were going to be going away. He was going to have life changes that very likely would positively affect the issue that he's experiencing now. And this was something that was pretty much the exact same scenario in the past. And so, with like a different body part, but it was very, very similar in that respect. And so I threw it out there, because this was he's not working with me yet. He's not paying with. So, like, I laid it out there. Like, I want you to know, or I want to know what you think about this. I think once this and this goes away in the next few weeks, this issue is going to drastically improve. And you don't need me for that to happen. And I'm not sure that right now there's a lot that I could do for you in this moment, other than he was already doing a bunch of modalities that were like managing the pain in the short term. So I thought those were great. I mean, those are fine strategies. You just got to get through this like phase, this like next 2 to 3 weeks. And so I put that I put that idea out there, but I asked for his perspective about that. And his perspective was, yeah, okay. I mean, that makes sense. I just wasn't sure if there was like something that I was missing, like, essentially a big rock that was being unturned, or, a fix, which I get. Like, ask if there is, like, if there was a magic pill, I'd tell you. And so, but that would be the exact same scenario if it was the same ailment and somebody was coming back, and just lay out the possibility that this could behave in the exact same way. And also, if you've had the conversations before, use this as an example of the things that we talked about, which was this thing might happen again. And hopefully you have the tools to manage it. But this, now you're coming back to me like, this is now the example of the thing happening again. This is it. So it's not different. And it doesn't mean that you didn't make good progress or you didn't have success our first time around. This is what we talked about. This is the moment. Because that's, again, one of those situations where sometimes people forget when they have the flare up, they forget that they talked about having future flare ups. And the mindset is, oh, well, now I'm back to ground zero. I've made no progress. This is sticking around. We have to try something else. Find the underlying cause is something that I hear a lot for people. It keeps happening. I want to find the underlying cause, which is tough because it's like, well, it's still the same thing. You're doing too much. It's not, like the underlying cause is, your obturator internus is inhibited or something that I could make up like that. So they're challenging, but get their perspective, I think, is the biggest thing that I would say. Understand it from their perspective.
Anything else on this topic that you feel like we didn't cover that you want to hit on before we close it out, or any just final thoughts?
Yeah, I think start small, microdose like what we're talking about here are like dialogues that could span months, depending on it could span the entire plan with this person. So it might sound like we're like speaking through a water hose at these people on day one and like trying to flip their world upside down from their expectations. And it's like, not that at all, because I've tried that and that doesn't work. People just kind of dig into what they believe in things harder, and then so do I. And then it becomes this frustrating thing where you're almost like trying to prove your own client wrong or something, which is it's not a good scenario. It's like toxic. So I think I say microdose your dialogues, plant the seed in the beginning and start small and have revisit these conversations frequently in small doses. It's like, hey, I know that this is kind of what we had talked about in terms of being an endpoint for you getting to this point in your desired activity, whatever that is, and here's where we are. What are you thinking about that as our goal to shoot for? Continue, like trying to update where they are. You were to kind of recalibrate little by little with each setback. Understand where they are, but try to anchor it to something that you've talked about. If it is something that's not a big deal and you feel is going to go away, just go back to what you said, but just don't make it a big deal. Not everything has to be a 30-minute like kumbaya session either. Just small doses, move forward. Small doses, move forward. Ask questions, get their understanding of things, but then do something. Move forward. I've just found that people, they just want to feel heard. They want to feel heard, and they want to understand that you have that you can have that you're confident in what you're saying also, and like you can have a plan. And sometimes they just need reassurance that the plan is still the plan, even though this new thing that they in their mind is new and different and might require a new plan. Nope, same plan. Move forward. Oh, okay, boom. So I think that's the biggest takeaway is what we're talking about is very important. It's a big deal, but it's not something that needs to take a whole entire session of you just like talking about these things. So it's just small doses. It's not easy. It's still not easy for me. It's challenging. Human interaction and communication is challenging. It's always going to be challenging. And in fact, the more you try to emphasize it and try to improve upon these skills, the harder it is, because you start to uncover all of the nuances of kind of what we talked about. It's way easier to put the blinders on and just let time run its course and to like do what you think they want. And those types of things. So just understand that easy is not the goal here. Like what you and I are talking about on this call is just more of, it's just better is the goal. So yeah, I think that's how I'd leave it.
I think that's a great place to stop. Quinn, thank you so much for this conversation. Let's call it there. Thank you again.